It was during actually when the Soviet Union still existed, 90 and 91. I did do consulting work with the Moscow city government and the Russian parliament, but I mostly was doing my work with what was then still the Soviet Republic of Lithuania. They wanted to break away and regain their national independence, establish a free society and a free economy. So I was doing consulting work there on privatization and market reform. How do you privatize collective farms, apartment buildings, factories, uh, create the institutional and fiscal environment to act as a stimulus and an incentive for both domestic entrepreneurial development and to attract direct foreign investment. So they were thinking of their future uh, for when the time came, which it eventually did, when they regained their national independence when the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991.
So that kind of puts you in a position to know a little bit of the inner workings of what it's like to be in that part of the world and dealing with economic issues, even though that was a different era. Do you see any similarities to the way that they function now? Do you think that there have been reforms? I mean, how has it evolved?
Well, of course, it all depends on what part of the former Soviet Union you're talking about. The Baltic republics such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have done exceptionally well in reconstruction, reform, integrating themselves into the European community. They are members of the European Union as well as NATO. They are basically what we would consider modern and normal Western civilization countries. It has been more difficult in countries, to be honest, like Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine more than
Hmm.
once, and they have had, unfortunately, a high degree of political corruption, degrees of political and democratic instability. They've had these problems lingering and going on with the Russian Federation, primarily having to do with the Russian president, Putin, uh, going back now 8 years in a very violent way. There was what was called an Orange Revolution, in which a pro-Putin president in Ukraine was pressured to step down and to leave the country.
Hmm.
Elections were held, and they elected a government that was more pro-Western, and in fact wanted to join both the European Union as a goal, as well as NATO. Um, Putin reacted extremely negatively to this, to lose sort of a client state and a more pliant Ukrainian president, and
Hmm.
began to create these instigations, first infiltrating what were known at the time in 2014 as the Little Green Men. That is clearly Russian military personnel in uniforms without markings, but who subversively were beginning the process of taking over the Crimea and leading to its eventual annexation by Russia.
So I think these guys got their training from the guards outside of Buckingham Palace because they're not saying a word to anybody. А извините, вы можете сказать, из какой базы вы, из какой страны? Вы можете ответить на какой-нибудь вопрос? Yeah, they don't want to say anything. They're not wearing any insignia, but it's pretty clear that they're Russian.
And then to foster these ethnic tensions in the eastern part of Ukraine, claiming, as Putin does, is that the Ukrainians were oppressing the Russian-speaking and Russian ethnic peoples. It is true, fair and balanced here, that many Ukrainians have had their tensions with elements of the Russian-speaking segments of the population in East Ukraine. But to accuse the Ukrainians in any way, shape, or form, as Putin has been doing for the last 8 years and now culminating in this invasion of Ukraine, oh, the Ukrainians are undertaking genocide. They want to abolish the Russian-speaking and ethnic population. The Russians had to save these people from total destruction. This is total exaggeration. The fact is,
Right.
uh, compared to many other parts in the world, and certainly far from being perfect, the people of Ukraine, regardless of what religion they may practice, language they may speak, culture they may feel more comfortable with, are basically under had and operated with a wide degree of cultural and linguistic and religious and social liberties and tolerance and freedoms.
Right.
Listen, we all know that every society has its idiots and jerks and who show bigotry and bias. But hello, what's new about that anywhere on the planet? But in general, these were not the problems any more than many other places in Ukraine. It has been a fairly open and fairly democratic and fairly civil liberties respecting society with a high degree of the type of crony capitalism and connection corruption that is very typical, unfortunately, of too many countries in the world.
This mansion is now called the Museum of Corruption and is the symbol of Yanukovych's opulence and theft. The residence is one of the largest wood residential buildings in the world. It has 4 floors and occupies more than 600 square meters. The area of the entire Mezhyhirya residence is 170 hectares, or 420 acres. The estate boasts sports and sauna complexes, a landscape park, golf courses, tennis courts, football fields, and a hunting ground. It even has access to the Kyiv Sea and its own private zoo.
But certainly nothing that meets this imagery that Putin is trying to create, that this is a country controlled by neo-Nazis and he's liberating them from fascist oppression. And the Ukrainian people are just waiting with bated breath and little Russian flags to welcome the liberators. And I think the events of the last few weeks since the Russians invaded and the resistance by the Ukrainians, men, women, even children, whether the people feel more comfortable speaking the Ukrainian or the Russian languages, the opposition, the resistance, the unwillingness to surrender demonstrates that Putin created this propagandistic lies and illusions that have nothing to do with the reality on the ground. The world, unfortunately, is never completely black and white. And one side is not completely right and the other side is completely wrong. It is true that for a good number of years, both in 2014 and actually before that, the representatives of the United States government, the State Department and other branches of the government, have attempted to push Ukraine in a direction similar than the United States and a number of other NATO countries wanted to do with Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War.
Newland and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, discuss which of the country's opposition leaders they'd like to see in government, and they refer to getting the UN involved.
And even though only verbally it appears from the records, American and other Western high political officials made promises, nothing in paper as far as I've seen, that once the Soviets withdrew from Eastern Europe, and then, of course, when the Soviet Union itself collapsed, and it just was now the independent republics and Russia, that neither the United States nor NATO would make any active attempt to incorporate the former Soviet bloc countries into NATO, and therefore sort of calm any fears that might linger in the minds of those in the Russian government that somehow the United States wanted to take advantage and encircle and attempt to manipulate internal events in Russia. The fact is that the U.S. government and a number of, particularly U.S. government, but some other European governments, did in fact prod and push and enthusiastically incorporate these things. Now, one has to understand it's not as if America, twisted anybody's arm in Poland or the Baltic republics. These countries had been dominated in the 19th century by the Russian Empire, and in the 20th century, certainly following the Second World War, by the Soviet Union. The communism may have gone in Russia, but they always had a fear of Russia in the longer historical sense as the imperialist power attempting to dominate, control, and incorporate them. And they happily, willingly, wanted to become members of the NATO Defense Alliance, as well as joining the European Union, as a way of not just only opening themselves to wider markets and cultural interaction, but as a sense of a mutual defense, that if little Estonia, which only has a population of approximately 1.5 million, were to be again threatened with Russian intimidation and or invasion, that they could rely upon Article 5 of the NATO agreement, that an attack on one country is an attack on all. So they wanted to join NATO. The United States did not twist their arm. And there are many in Ukraine who wanted to join NATO. So in that sense, the United States did not twist their arm. But the United States did nothing to tell, particularly the Ukraine, that if you attempted to do this, you seem to be a particular bee in Putin's bonnet. And if you really push to do this, and we then have to decide either to actually vote on you or not, you're going to be creating a high degree of a crisis problem with your immediate eastern neighbor. The United States did not help creating the current problem.
Today, we proudly welcome Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. We welcome them into the ranks of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When NATO was founded, the people of these 7 nations were captives to an empire. They endured bitter tyranny. They struggled for independence. They earned their freedom through courage and perseverance. And today they stand with us as full and equal partners in this great alliance.
Okay, but what I'm thinking here as well is that there's so much virtue signaling. Like, I had seen somebody on Twitter put out hashtags like, Ukraine is the new George Floyd. This was literally the hashtag. So I'm trying to figure out, what does this all mean? Why does it seem to be the Democrats who are very much pro-Ukraine in a virtue signaling kind of way, rather than like an ordinary person who can see that there's pain and suffering and casualties in Ukraine over this political mess. But why is it, though, that the Democrats in particular, and some Republicans as well, but why is this becoming politicized in a way that people seem to be enthusiastically putting themselves behind? It's taken over the media, right? So that always is a flag for me.
Well, as a senior advisor to Barack Obama once said, you should never let a crisis go to waste.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. I think America as a whole in 1973 and 1974, and not just my view, but obviously the administration, missed the opportunity to deal with the energy crisis that was before us. For a long time, our entire energy policy came down to cheap oil. This is an opportunity. What used to be long-term problems, be they in the healthcare area, energy area, education area, fiscal area, tax area, regulatory reform area, things that we had postponed for too long that were long-term are now immediate and must be dealt with. And this crisis provides the opportunity for us, as I would say, the opportunity to do things that you could not do before.
And now the Biden administration has been doing very poorly domestically. A lot of the opinion polls, and of course, half a year in politics is like a century, so you never know how things are going to play out. But the fact is, all the public opinion polls are suggesting that the Republicans will regain at least one of the 2 houses of Congress, maybe both. So the razor-thin majority that the Democrats have had in the Congress will be gone. And how do you sort of attract people's attention away from the domestic sorrows, than to rally the country around a firm president who's willing to stand up to tyrants abroad who are oppressing other people who are too weak to defend themselves. And therefore, it's the news cycle. It looks good for Biden. Now, in fact, polls seem to show that people are not reacting to Biden seeming to be this new FDR leading America in a grand world war. But I think that's a part of it. The other part of it is that to push a political paternalistic agenda, which the Democrats seem and progressives seem to have endemically part of their psychology.
Yes.
You have to have something to be pushing. And to say, for example, that Ukraine and what's going on is the new George Floyd, it's this idea there are oppressed people and the paternalists must correct the problems and alleviate this. And we must make sacrifices for them. Now, I'm going to sound very cynical and perhaps too cynical, but it seems to me that the Democrats are willing to continue their virtue signaling to the last Ukrainian life.
Yes. That's what I take from this, right? What are you actually doing to help people there? If you're making the situation worse, how is that virtue signaling? Like, it might feel good you see people pouring out bottles of Russian vodka and things in the liquor stores and saying, we're not going to sell this anymore. And it makes a good Instagram video or whatever else. But what is that actually doing to the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine? They're both just citizens, innocents in a way, who are involved in this geopolitical tangle.
Let me sort of just emphasize, Putin is the aggressor in this war.
Yes.
And his forces are clearly being unbelievably brutal and indiscriminate in their bombing and strafing of Ukrainian populations and their cities. You see these pictures on our news programs and on social media, and they resemble those totally obliterated cities in Central Europe during the Second World War from Allied bombing in the campaign to defeat Nazi Germany, or like Warsaw being bombed into rubble by the Nazis. But the thing that has, and they're showing a great degree of heroism. The men, women, and children, their courage, their willingness to stand up to a very strong opponent is nothing to be commended. But the fact is that at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, can they win? Is it possible for them to triumph over this larger, more powerful neighbor, if that neighbor, as Putin seems to be, willing to do whatever it takes to see that the war ends the way he wants it to? And our virtue signaling is accompanied by armament shipments and supply shipments, which the Ukrainians want, and they seem to be putting to very good use. But we have to ask the question, however heroic and inspiring their bravery and their desire for their national independence may be, at the end of the day, will they succeed if the United States and NATO were not to directly intervene on their behalf? And no one has a crystal ball to determine what's going to happen next week or a month from now if this conflict goes on. But surely the probability is at the end of the day, even with these Western military and other supports, short of actual Western intervention, they will not triumph. They will be slowly worn down and beaten and driven into surrender, or basically underground into guerrilla warfare. Now, how capable will the Russians be in occupying a country that is larger than France, has approximately 40 million people, the vast majority of whom do not want the Russians there? That may itself be a suicide mission, but it will be a suicide mission that, because it has been continued and prolonged until the point that is where it has come to, that an immense amount of Ukrainians will die, and their cities will be even more severely damaged than they have been already. And it will be that much more difficult out of that rubble for the reconstruction and rebirth, both politically and economically, for that society.
Right.
And
And NATO has said they won't step in, correct?
NATO has made it very clear that since Ukraine is not a formal member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, all the appeals by the Ukrainian government will not receive a positive response for NATO forces to enter the war. That is the reason why, in spite of the continual appeal, the NATO organization and the United States have made it clear that there will be no NATO-provided no-fly zone above Ukrainian airspace, because it runs the risk of coming into conflict with Russian air power. And
Yes.
if dogfights were to break out, and if planes were to be shooting at each other, and if NATO forces had to take out Russian anti-aircraft installations and other military equipment on the ground, that is then a war with Russia. Now, would Putin himself want to push it that far? If push came to shove, maybe the bluster is just bluster and he would back down. But you cannot be sure, and you run the serious risk that a conflict could get out of hand. And it does not help the Ukrainians if a good part of Europe and even a part of the United States is severely damaged in a global Holocaust.
Wow. So this is really a very, very bad situation, clearly. He, I think, may be building some kind of Eurasian alliance. Is that possible?
You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is how the Russians and the Chinese view each other. They have had a highly tense relationship going back a very long time, to the 19th century, and then into the 20th century with two communist regimes that ended up being in competition with each other after Stalin's death and the rise of Chairman Mao. But the fact is that there is an alliance between them in the sense that both view the United States and the West in general as an impediment to their own respective designs. Putin attempting to reverse the Cold War end and reestablish Russian control, or at least sphere of influence, over former Soviet republics and into Eastern Europe, the captive nations of the Cold War. And China's view, people like the president of China, Xi Jinping, who view that this century, the 21st century, should be China's century. America will go into eclipse. China is growing more and more as an economic and political and military power. And it will become, if not then one of the two or three leading political powers of the world, great powers of the world. And that the world will respect China and be intimidated by China and do the kowtow, as was expected to do before Chinese emperors. People came for audiences to China.
Right.
And that therefore there is this alliance. It doesn't mean that it's one like unending, or that there's no conflicts or tensions between them. But as long as the United States is viewed by both of them as more of the immediate threat or concern to advance their own respective interests, then each will view the other as a valuable ally. Now, it's ambiguous as to how much the Chinese are going to use a Stalinist phrase, pull the Russian chestnuts out of the fire, because then China is going to possibly be enveloped in the issue of, do they become subject to some of the American and Western sanctions, which they do not want.
Right.
But it is clear that that for their own respective purposes, they view themselves as participating in a common front against the United States and the West in general.
So let's also talk a little bit about fuel, because Biden made his address today and he talked about how Americans would need to make sacrifices. And, you know, we've seen everybody who drives a car goes to the pump now and has seen this week the gas prices have soared and seem to be rising. And so the one thing that I do think seems a little bit odd is that it's very open that all of the world leaders, and especially Biden's Build Back Better campaign, want to move away from oil and gas towards more green energy. And I wonder if it's just a coincidental thing, or if it's just kind of a positive outcome of the whole situation, that fuel becomes less and less affordable for people, and that people decide that they're nudged in a way into turning away from that, or those fuel-driven behaviors, such as taking trips in their car and other things like that.
Well, I think two things are coming out of these sanctions. First of all, it is establishing a very bad additional precedent on the powers of the executive branch to impose arbitrary rules and restrictions on what Americans can do and with whom. COVID has become a precedent in which the executive and state governments can basically tell people, we are going to declare by executive order, don't produce, don't go to work, don't leave your home, only shop when we tell you to, and for those commodities or items that we have defined as essential in any type of pandemic or related domestic health crisis. That's a very bad precedent. But matching that now with the Ukrainian business and these sanctions is that we basically have the president of the United States either intimidating or ordering Americans with whom they can trade. In other words, American oil companies have been basically told that they may not import oil from Russia. Remember, this is not the normal legal process where there's debate and deliberation in Congress, legislation passes between the House and the Senate, it goes to the president for a signature, and that's the way laws are supposed to be passed in the United States. They may be good laws or bad laws, depending upon how you're looking at it. But that's how the legal process is supposed to bring legislation into effect. Biden is just saying this is a national security emergency because of our concerns about the political instability of what is going on in Ukraine. And Russia is the perpetrator. And I am now telling American oil importers they may not import oil from Russia. Now, the thing is, it's not even the issue, do you feel right that, something should be done to Russia to cut off their financial capacity? It's the fact that there's this precedent of that when any president decides that there is an international crisis of sufficient magnitude, and at his own discretion, he's going to tell Americans what they can do, with whom they can trade, what they can buy, from what producer, and whether they can sell it or not. Basically, the president, in his self-proclaimed national crisis, can command people to go about their economic affairs the way he wants them to. This is very dangerous as another precedent of the growth of government paternalism and command in American society. And if I can just comment about your second part of this, there is no doubt that from the point of view of the those who talk about climate change and global warming and think, we have 42 minutes to correct everything or we all die by burning to a crisp. For them, this oil crisis, as you were saying, means that oil prices are going up and probably will go up more for an unknown time. And, well, then they can say, look here, energy alternatives, solar power, wind power, etc., anything, of course, other than nuclear, is now not just technologically possible, but economically feasible. So this crisis raises the price of fossil fuels sufficiently that artificially, these environmentalist preferred energy alternatives now seem economically feasible. So this isn't the market making these choices.
Yes.
This is a political process that manipulates the deck of cards among the prices of the market as to what seems cost efficient and what not. So this is a manipulation of the price mechanism to get a political agenda advanced that some ideologists on the left want to see pursued.
We can create an environment that raises the standard of living around the world. And this is a moral imperative, but it's also an economic imperative. If we fuel greater growth, new jobs, better opportunities for all our people, and as we see current volatility in energy prices, rather than cast it as a reason to back off our clean energy goals, we must view it as a call to action. High energy prices only reinforce the urgent need to diversify sources, double down on clean energy development, and adapt promising new clean energy technologies so we can not only we don't remain overly reliant on one source of power to power our economies and our communities. It's in the self-interest of every single nation. And this is a chance, in my view, to make a generational investment in our economic resilience and on our workers and our communities throughout the world. That's what we're going to do in the United States. My Build Back Better framework will make historic investments in clean energy, the most significant investment to deal with the climate crisis that any advanced nation has made ever.
Now, I just want to read this to you because I was thinking about this and I pulled this up. This is Arthur Koestler. I don't know if you've ever read Darkness at Noon. So he said, and it just popped into my head as you were speaking, in a crisis, and politics is one permanent crisis, those in power could always declare a state of emergency to justify exceptional measures. For as long as there have been nations and classes, they live in a state of mutual self-defense, which constantly forces them to postpone their humanistic program to some later date. And this is where we find ourselves, in a state of permanent crisis. COVID crisis is kind of wrapping up. Here's the next one.
Yes. And also keep in mind that along with these crises that rationalize, justify the continual growth and paternalistic envelopment of government over our lives, it does not come without a financial cost. Biden has talked about another $10 billion in aid to the Ukrainians. That obviously there's going to have to be increases in the military budgets. The Europeans have promised to do this. Those who are the policy planners in the Pentagon will know we need better equipment. We need more equipment. We need improved cyber counterintelligence methods. We need to have the national security agencies will say we need greater surveillance powers because you don't know where this is going to go. And that means not just more extended control and power and authority for these government agencies, but more spending. And let's keep in mind that we now have a national debt of about $30 trillion. Even in what is now the post-COVID era, more or less, the federal government is running and will be running, according to the Congressional Budget Office, for the foreseeable fiscal future, $1 trillion or more deficits per year for at least the next 10 years and beyond, if nothing were to change. So this is involving growing debt, deficits of this magnitude that will put pressure on the Federal Reserve to continue being the monetary spigot to make the dollars available that they create to fund what the government wants to spend. And all of the negative resulting effects of price inflation, where price inflation diminishes the purchasing power of the dollar, destroys all of our accumulated savings and wealth, distorts investment and economic decision-making, and therefore slows down the capacity of Americans to make rational and reasonable and future-oriented productive choices. And this is what this is all going to lead to if this path is continued down this way.